One of the main services that private security companies are involved in, that's kind of one of the motivations for this project, is detention centers. So that's either in processing centers or even in longer-term detention centers or processing centers before deportation, where migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers are under the supervision of private security companies who are looking after them and in almost prison-like conditions can be. The next would be border guarding. So this is where private security companies are involved in either at border crossing points or on borders more generally. And we see this in the US-Mexico border. We even know that private security companies are known to wear similar uniforms to law enforcement officers, which can cause issues of confusion with migrants and refugees, and brings up questions of state sovereignty, authority, and who has the right to act on behalf of the state. Then we see private security companies involved in transportation and deportation services. This can be transferring migrants from their point of arrival in a country to a processing center. We see this maybe in the UK, where migrants arrive on the Kent coast and then are brought to processing centers in Manston, notably in the news recently. Or it can be accompanying migrants as they're taken out of the country by plane or other means. Then we see private security companies offering services at sea in relation to migration. So we see this as migration pushbacks, so small migrant boats which are found at sea, and private security companies can be involved in pushing the boats back out of a country's territorial waters, either into a different country's territorial waters or into international waters. And this can cause real problems for question of non-refoulement, when they can then be taken into the responsibility of potentially persecuting state. We also see private security companies operating drones at sea, perhaps working to detect small migrant boats at sea. And then we know, for instance, between Libya and Italy, private security companies are known to have worked with the Libyan Coast Guard to report instances where they found migrant small boats for the Libyan Coast Guard then to be able to pick them up later. And then there are other services which are offered. Many of these relate to the services that I mentioned before. So, translation services, offering nutrition, mental health services in detention centers, as limited as it may be. And then also using mobile phone tracking technology to detect the mass movement of people, and relaying that to law enforcement to prevent people either leaving a country or entering a new country. So the reasons why that states tend to contract private security companies in these instances is, similar to any other state outsourcing of or outsourcing to private enterprises of state responsibilities. Primarily, there's this perception of it being lower cost, more efficient, better value for money. And whilst that certainly is one of the logics, we are not so sure whether that is necessarily the case. We know that, for instance, the Obama administration, towards the end of its term, was looking to close down privately run detention centers in the US because they were found to be less cost efficient and perhaps resulted in greater instances of violence. So it's not clear, but that indicates that there are perhaps more migration-specific areas to look at. So one of these is the lack of state capacity, which is also, similar reasoning for any outsourcing of state responsibilities. But this is particular to migration in the sense that migration flows are a lot less predictable than criminality. You get influxes and spikes of migration levels, which require a quicker response, which state standing capacity cannot deal with. At the same time, it's also a political choice. Migration services can be outsourced to private sector companies, as it's the choice of incoming administrations whether they should open migration detention centers or not. And therefore, to do this quickly requires the use of the private sector as opposed to law enforcement. At the same time, it's also a higher risk practice, both in terms of responsibility in international law for things that can go wrong, Detaining migrants in general is a contentious issue in international law. And then on the political side, there is often blowback from the public, where people often protest against the detention of migrants, in general. So outsourcing to private security companies is seen as a way to divulge risk and pass it on to a third actor. Whether this works, again, is a difficult question, as we often see political protest against the state outsourcing of migration services to private sector companies. And on a legal perspective, it's less clear. It's a muddy water. Even if the legal apparatus is supposedly clear, the application is certainly not. And because of the high-risk nature of these contracts, it means it can be lucrative. And of course, that's the attraction of it. But having said that, there are only a small number of companies involved, and they tend to be the larger companies that are involved in offering these services. So what can go wrong? There are a various number of human rights abuses that can occur. The first being, common to any form of deprivation of liberty would be forced labor. This is known to happen in ICE detention centers in the US, but it can be a risk more widely as well. The second would be healthcare. That's either access to healthcare, which can be difficult for professionals, certainly in remote centers, and then also unhygienic conditions, malnutrition leading to health problems in general, and then the general conditions, as well as the lack of knowledge about where outcomes are coming, can lead to various mental health problems. And mental health support in migration detention services is notoriously lacking. Then you have questions of legal aid, access to legal representation. Not only, as with healthcare professionals, some of these centers are very difficult to access for legal professionals. There are also instances of arbitrary restriction of access, which dramatically reduces a migrant's or someone's chance of having their asylum claim processed correctly. Then there's a lack of denial of cultural rights. So denial of education, religious freedom, be it in access to prayer time, access to religious materials, and also access to leisure time. As well as being human rights abuses in themselves, they can also lead to further problems for mental health. Then, of course, there are physical and sexual abuse issues. We know, as the students from the researchers from the Graduate Institute will talk about, there are instances of gender-based violence, which can be a real problem. And then there are heavy-handed enforcement practices, which, given the nature of the migration sector, we're dealing with people in vulnerable situations rather than people who have committed crimes necessarily. This heavy-handed enforcement practices can actually be a real problem. And then you have questions of refoulement and not respecting the duty of non-refoulement. If private security companies are known to return migrants to their country of origin without having correctly processed their claims, then they can be returning them to countries where they may be trafficked, maybe victims of torture or other exploitation and abuse. And in the language of business and human rights, this can see private security companies being or directly contributing to these abuses. There are certain conditions in the code, the International Code of Conduct, which deal directly with these issues. For instance, guarding and transporting prisoners, operating civilian detention centers. Crowd management as well is a real issue, especially where there are issues of riots occurring in prisons and following abuses. But we know that the issue still exists. There are things that are still going wrong. And to present why things are still going wrong, I'll give the stage to the researchers from the Graduate Institute.